My entire academic career has been building to this moment with you all here, and I'm so glad to be sharing my project with you. Enjoy! Our main story tonight revolves around access to open space. My project is titled Inclusive Open Space, Moving Beyond the ADA, or Americans with Disabilities Act.
Over 1 billion people worldwide have a disability. That's more than 15% of the world's population. Most live in developing countries. This number is expected to grow due to factors such as conflict, aging, stunting, and natural disasters. Persons with disabilities face higher rates of poverty compared with others. They encounter biases and barriers when accessing basic services. When they're excluded, it's harder to escape the cycle of poverty and marginalization.
My project explores the intersection of the lived experience of people with disability and their desire to use public spaces. I aim to understand whether meeting ADA accessibility guidelines provided adequate inclusion of people with physical impairment at Green Lake Park in Seattle. I expected to find that the ADA does not do enough to create inclusive spaces, and we should go above and beyond the policy to better facilitate inclusion of all. My completed project analyzes existing barriers to physical accessibility in Green Lake Park, both from narrative evaluations and my own written evaluation. My goal for completing this project was to bring advocacy for people with disabilities into the planning conversation. Historically, physical disability has been ignored or seen as an afterthought in the composition of cities and open spaces. I want to prove, in part, that we can create safe and accessible public space by involving more people in the planning process. Planning is by nature exclusionary out of necessity and lack of resources. With any number of issues facing a city at once and little political will behind many of those, planners of the 21st century are in triage mode, trying to pass intermediary but progressive steps towards real solution. Be that way though. If we as planners and communities invest in some cultural relativity and seek to understand others and their needs, we can find that some of those needs can be accomplished with little cost, financial or otherwise.
This morning, inclusive parks and playgrounds are becoming more and more common these days. The city of Coleman opened one just last week. CBS 42 News reporter Conan Gasquet joining us now live in the studio. So Conan, one of the things that makes these parks unique is the safety options that they offer.
Yeah, if you're familiar with inclusive parks, you probably think about the options they offer for kids with special needs, but they also have options that enhance the overall experience for all kids. That's why they're called inclusive, because they're designed for everyone. Those with special needs have modified swings and other features, but kids without special needs can enjoy the park as well. And there's also a special safety feature in the one in Coleman. It's the artificial turf that was put in place to prevent injuries.
You know, there's a little bit of a spring and softness to the turf. There's a 4-inch pad under it. So if a child like mine that's 3 years old falls off a play feature, they just bounce right back up and keep going.
Turf also is designed to dry quickly and easily in the event of rain, so kids can get right back to having fun shortly after that rain subsides. Birmingham and Hoover are planning to add similar parks in the future, and Schlossfest is adding sensory inclusive options as well. That makes them the first festival in the country to do so. Guys, back.
Public spaces, such as parks, are the last bit of communal area we have left in our society, and the exclusion of groups from that has exponential externalities and impacts for the creation of a sympathetic and overall better society. The history of my project centers around the Americans with Disabilities Act, passed in 1990, and the implications that it has had on public policy. Let's listen to George H.W. Bush describe this moment in history.
And it's been a coalition in the finest spirit, a joining of Democrats and Republicans, of the legislative and the executive branches, of federal and state agencies, of public officials and private citizens, of people with disabilities and without. This historic act is the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. The first.
He is correct, or was in 1990. Since then, the UN created a joint resolution called the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which the U.S. has not ratified. Let's listen to two people explain their views on the policy.
Joining us to talk about the prospects for a vote on the convention and 2 points of view on what it means for the United States is Representative Jim Langevin of Rhode Island and Michael Ferris. He's Chancellor of Patrick Henry College in Virginia and the chairman of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association.
This is both a policy statement, but it's also a policy in substance. Ratifying the treaty sets out broad principles to which nations would aspire to when they're passing their laws or when they're reviewing their laws and their access to public accommodations or even how they treat people with disabilities, that people with disabilities aren't hidden or brushed aside, but they are actually, it would be included in society. Again,
treaties are not merely aspirational documents. They're international law. They have binding legal effects. I believe that the United States should make the law for itself, and that I don't believe that using international law to control domestic policy is the most effective way to deliver the kind of services that we need for our disabled community.
Because a number of Republicans are arguing in favor of this. Senator John McCain, former Attorney General Richard Thornburgh, Senator Bob Dole, as we saw.
There are a number of people that are on the moderate side of the Republican Party that have supported the treaty.
It is such important, and it weakens our argument if we don't pass and ratify.
Much different tone just 20 years later. In December 2012, the Senate voted against ratification of the CRPD by a vote of 61 to 38. When doing my preliminary research, I had a hard time finding any planning literature that had disability as a major or secondary theme. I quickly realized my research would need to attack the problem from multiple directions, a pattern I repeated in my methodology. My two categories for research became parks and other community spaces, where a number of urban planning articles have highlighted the importance of parks, what can happen when we exclude people from these spaces, and the equity issues tied to park location and funding. Then I transitioned into disability studies, whose literature engages with how the experience of disability is borne out in the urban environment, the temporality of able-bodiedness, and highlights what I saw, which was a clear lack of planners engaging with disability advocates. When it came time to actually do my work, I chose a mixed methodology, including narrative interviews and an ADA assessment of the park to identify any gaps in the two understandings of the space. I spoke to park users experiencing mobility impairment and professionals who are currently developing park spaces. From those experiencing mobility impairment, I wanted to understand ways they are currently using Green Lake Park, places where they have experienced difficulty, and what we can work on to make the park more accessible and inclusive. From the working professionals, I hope to gain institutional insights to help facilitate better inclusion. Narrative evaluations from both of these groups help me get a better perspective on the current process for creating inclusive spaces. Finally, I evaluated Green Lake Park using the City of Seattle's ADA Park Assessment. During its use, I reflected on how well it achieves true inclusion and notating it as I went along. Using what I learned from the park and the process from the evaluation and from the narratives of those involved in using and creating the park, I was able to draw some conclusions together about places where we are servicing true inclusion and places where we need to grow in order to reach a truly universal space. In speaking to the residents at the Hearthstone, a retirement facility across the street from Green Lake Park, I was able to gather many useful pieces of information for how the residents use the park and the barriers they see. First, the most present piece of information was the safety they felt on the inside track. For those of you who haven't been to Green Lake, the park has an inner paved path that measures just short of 3 miles around. On that path, users include walkers, bikers, rollerbladers, parents with strollers, walkers with dogs, some off-leash, and some electronically powered bikes. According to the majority of residents interviewed, this limited their use of the park, choosing instead to walk on the sidewalks around the community. The residents attributed this to the lack of a separate pathway for different speed users, as well as old and confusing wayfinding signs and mileage markers. Many residents told me about users entering the wrong lanes, and other park users letting their dogs off leashes, and the dogs running up to the walkers and unbalancing them. Additionally, the access point for crossing the street from the Hearthstone was recently updated. Still, a number of residents mentioned issues with crossing the street and the maintenance of the street. Finally, many residents mentioned the far spacing between benches and lack of bathrooms spaced around the walkway, which were things I had noted in my survey of the park. Looking a little higher level, Many residents mentioned not being able to access community meetings or development meetings because of the lack of easy transportation options and the location of the meetings, as well as the tendency for feedback to be received digitally, creating a barrier for older folks who are not as tech savvy. I am so thankful I was able to speak to residents at the Hearthstone and learn these valuable lessons for my final project. I interviewed one landscape design consultant and one ADA compliant staff member at Seattle Parks Department. I found that most inclusive spaces or aspects of parks had input from users before development. Educated suppliers led to better outcomes. Inclusivity requires brainpower that some, not all, are already doing. And the biggest barriers to inclusion are funding and post-occupancy studies. First, parks that had an opportunity for and received feedback from users were the most likely to have accessibility or accessible features, which makes sense because the more people we involve in the process, the more feedback we can gather on designs from different perspectives. Bell Street Park is an example of this, where the ribbed pattern on the sidewalk was workshopped multiple times before being implemented. Next, educating suppliers leads to better parks because it adds to the building network of accessibility-focused consultants. Inclusion takes cities prioritizing using those firms and explaining that the city won't use firms that haven't made progress towards improving access. An example of this is a sign maker who won't implement braille or high contrast color on signs for parks. Further, inclusivity takes extra brainpower, and some firms are already creating accessible plans. Like I mentioned before, we need to continue to build on this momentum and network of accessibility-focused firms and encourage more firms to take that extra step by contracting only with those that have made the necessary changes. Finally, the biggest barriers to inclusivity are funding and post-occupancy studies. In my intro, I mentioned how planners are in triage mode and often don't get the resources needed to solve all the issues the city is facing, so they must choose the issues to face. Post-occupancy studies, while extremely valuable, are costly and don't often rise to the level of other issues that the city is facing. However, this means the city cannot learn from what they've tried before and pass on those lessons. I'm really thankful to have met with these professionals and look forward to incorporating their feedback in my final project. Using the ADA assessment was an interesting and enlightening experience. I found a few deficiencies, some of which will be fixed in the upcoming development cycle. I found issues with the slope at Latona Avenue, the entrance to the community center bathrooms, which are not accessible at all, the height of the handicap parking signs in the parking lot, and the rails at the entrance to the community center. More interesting, the checklist was easy to use, explained the requirements and where to find them in the code. As I was using it, there were no glaring pieces missing in the checklist, and the existing code seemed to provide basic accessibility. More work should be done if this project is applied elsewhere to make sure that city code extends the basic requirements of the ADA, as is the case in Seattle. We must include different ability levels in our planning process to truly facilitate equality in the public sphere. My biggest hope for this project was to create and facilitate a productive, conversational process from all parties involved, bringing together a collaborative and useful product that serves to create further conversation. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to answering your questions.